On the morning of July the 20th, 2026, inside the White House in Washington, President Donald Trump signed 3 documents that most Americans never heard about. No primetime address, no dramatic Rose Garden event, just 3 quiet presidential proclamations, stacked one on top of the other, that reached back nearly 100 years to pull a legal weapon off the shelf that no American president had ever actually fired. The tool was called Section 338 of the Tariff Act of 1930. It had been sitting in the federal code since the Smoot-Hawley era, mentioned in law school textbooks, cited occasionally by trade lawyers as a historical curiosity, but never once triggered to impose an actual tariff. Until that morning in Washington. And what it did was place a 50% tariff on nearly $20 billion worth of Canadian goods. That number, $20 billion, sounds almost survivable when you first hear it. Small, even, next to the trillion-dollar figures that get thrown around in modern trade wars. But the fine print buried inside those 3 proclamations may end up costing the United States far more than the number on the surface suggests. This is the story of what's actually written into that fine print, why it matters more than the headline tariff rate, and why, 4 days from the moment this is being told to you, the countdown to August 19th is about to reach 0 in Washington. Let's start with what actually happened, because the sequence matters. According to the U.S. Trade Representative's Office, the 3 proclamations Trump signed on July 20th each targeted a different sector, where the administration alleges Canada has been discriminating against American commerce. The first proclamation covers motor vehicles, the second covers alcoholic beverages, the third covers dairy products. Each proclamation stands on its own legal footing, each one accusing Canada of treating American goods worse than goods from other trading partners, which is the specific legal trigger required under Section 338. The White House, through USTR, estimated that combined, the 3 proclamations affect close to $20 billion in Canadian imports annually. Independent analysis from the Center for Strategic and International Studies, using trade data monitor figures, put the number even more precisely at 20. $2 billion, or about 9% of everything the United States imports from Canada in a typical year. Those tariffs are scheduled to take effect at 12:01 a.m. Eastern Time on August 19th, 2026, for any goods entered for consumption or withdrawn from a bonded warehouse for consumption on or after that date. That date, August 19th, is the fuse. And as of today, that fuse is burning down fast. Now here's the part of the story most casual coverage skipped past, and it's the part that actually deserves your attention. For over a year, since early 2025, the Trump administration's various tariff actions against Canada had generally carved out an exception. If a product qualified as USMCA compliant, meaning it met the rules of origin under the United States-Mexico-Canada agreement that Trump himself negotiated during his first term, it was usually spared from the harshest tariff rates. That exemption covered a massive share of trade. According to the Tax Foundation's senior economist Alex Durante, speaking to HuffPost, more than 90% of goods coming from Canada were USMCA compliant. And under previous tariff rounds, that compliance meant protection. Businesses on both sides of the border built their entire cross-border supply chains around that assumption, trusting that if they followed the rules of origin, they'd avoid the worst of the tariff exposure. That assumption just collapsed. According to a client alert from the law firm MLT Aikens, and confirmed separately by White and Case and by Holland and Knight, the Section 338 tariffs apply to all covered goods regardless of whether they qualify as USMCA originating. Read that again, because it's the actual fine print buried inside the headline. USMCA compliance, the very thing companies spent years and legal budgets proving, does not exempt you from this particular 50% tariff. As MLT Aikens put it directly, this is a significant departure from earlier tariff measures, where a valid certificate of origin generally provided an exemption. For the first time, having done everything right under the trade agreement doesn't save you. Think about what that actually means on the ground in real supply chains for real American companies. A U.S. auto parts importer that spent months building USMCA compliance documentation for a shipment of Canadian-made components now finds that documentation essentially irrelevant to this specific 50% duty. A dairy processor bringing in Canadian milk protein concentrate, expecting the USMCA shield to apply the way it always had, discovers the shield has a hole in it now. According to the law firm Wiley, the tariffs specifically apply to certain goods of Canada, quote, including United States, Mexico, Canada, agreement-compliant goods, unquote, a phrase that would have sounded almost contradictory 18 months earlier. And it isn't just USMCA compliance that stops mattering. According to White and Case, there's no drawback available either, meaning companies that pay this tariff and later re-export the goods, or otherwise would normally qualify for a duty refund, don't get that relief here. The tariff, once paid, is paid. On top of that, White and Case notes these duties stack on top of any other applicable tariffs, taxes, fees, and charges, meaning if a Canadian product was already facing a Section 232 steel tariff, or a Section 301 duty for some other reason, this new 50% doesn't replace those, it piles directly on top of them. So who actually gets exempted here? According to the tariff proclamations themselves and confirmed by multiple law firms tracking the rollout, the carve-outs are narrow. Energy products are excluded. Potash, the fertilizer input critical to American farmers, is excluded. Fish and certain critical minerals are excluded. Products already covered under existing Section 232 tariffs are excluded from this particular action. Though again, that just means they're taxed under a different mechanism, not that they escape tariffs altogether. Everything else in the three targeted sectors, and this is where it gets bigger than most people initially assumed, is fair game. According to reporting from Thomson Reuters' Tax and Accounting Desk, if your compliance review stopped at the three headline categories of motor vehicles, alcohol, and dairy, you likely haven't found your actual exposure yet. Scroll down to Annex 2 of each proclamation, and the list broadens dramatically. Wine, hockey sticks, cement, plywood, furniture, fishing rods, seeds, clothing, wigs, swimming pools. These aren't typos, and they aren't jokes. They're actual line items sitting inside the formal tariff schedule tied to these proclamations. A company importing plywood from a Canadian mill for a housing project in the Midwest may have had no idea it was standing anywhere near a trade dispute about dairy quotas or auto discrimination. Yet, under Section 338's broad sectoral logic, it's now caught in the blast radius. Before moving forward, it's worth sitting with just how strange it is that a law this powerful sat completely unused for nearly 100 years. Section 338 was written into the original Tariff Act of 1930. The same broader piece of legislation remembered mostly for the Smoot-Hawley tariffs that many economists blame for deepening the Great Depression by triggering a wave of global retaliation. Section 338 itself was a narrower provision tucked inside that larger law, designed to give the president a tool to respond when a foreign country was found to be treating American commerce less favorably than commerce from other nations. For decades, American presidents had other, more commonly used tools available, so Section 338 simply never got invoked. Trade lawyers knew it existed the way people know an old fire extinguisher exists in the back of a closet. Present, technically functional, but never actually pulled off the wall. That changed on July 20th, 2026 in Washington, when this administration became the first in the statute's history to use it to impose an actual tariff. And because it had never been used, virtually nothing about its practical operation has been tested. No court has ruled on how broadly it can be applied. No prior administration ever had to defend its use in front of a judge. That absence of precedent is itself part of the fine print, because it means every company now caught inside these tariffs is operating inside a legal gray zone that didn't meaningfully exist before this summer. Let's step back and understand why this particular tool, Section 338, got pulled off a shelf where it had sat untouched for nearly a century. The answer traces back to a ruling that happened months earlier in February 2026 when the U.S. Supreme Court struck down a much broader set of tariffs the Trump administration had imposed under the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, commonly called IEEPA. That ruling didn't end the administration's appetite for tariffs, it just forced a search for alternative legal authority that could survive a court challenge. Section 301 requires the Office of the U.S. Trade Representative to open a formal investigation before tariffs can be imposed. Section 232 requires a national security finding, typically after a Commerce Department review. Section 338, by contrast, according to analysis from Thomson Reuters' Tax Desk, lets the president act by proclamation alone, no investigation and no formal hearing required, as long as the statutory trigger of foreign discrimination against American commerce can be identified. That procedural simplicity is exactly why, after the Supreme Court closed one door in February, this administration reached for a door that had been bolted shut since the Great Depression and found it still opened. It's also worth understanding just how differently Section 338 behaves compared to the tools American businesses had grown used to over the past year. Under Section 301, the process typically takes months, sometimes longer, because the U.S. Trade Representative's Office has to formally open an investigation, gather evidence, allow public comment periods, and publish findings before any tariff can legally be imposed. Under Section 232, the Commerce Department has to conduct a national security review and issue a formal report to the president before tariffs can follow. Both of those processes, however imperfect, at least give businesses advance warning and a chance to weigh in before the tariff actually lands. Section 338 skips all of that. According to the statute's own text, and confirmed by multiple law firms tracking this rollout, including Wiley and Butzel-Long, the president can act by proclamation alone, the moment he determines that a foreign country is discriminating against American commerce relative to its treatment of other trading partners. There's no mandatory comment period. There's no independent investigative report that has to be published first. That speed is precisely what made it attractive after the Supreme Court's February ruling closed off the broader IEPA pathway the administration had been relying on. It gave the White House a way to keep imposing significant tariffs without walking back through a lengthy Section 301 or Section 232 process for every new dispute. Now, what discrimination is the administration actually alleging against Canada, in concrete terms? Because Section 338 requires the government to point to something specific. On dairy, the proclamation alleges that Canada's dairy tariff rate quotas, negotiated with the United States under USMCA, are less favorable than the quotas Canada separately negotiated with the European Union under a different agreement called CETA, the Canada-EU Comprehensive Economic and Trade Agreement. According to White and Case's detailed breakdown, Canada's USMCA quota for cheese does not allow retailers to directly access and use that quota, while the equivalent quota under the EU's CETA agreement does grant that retail access. That gap, in the administration's framing, constitutes discrimination against American dairy exporters relative to European competitors. On motor vehicles and on alcohol, the justification leans more heavily on numbers the White House itself has published. According to a White House fact sheet cited by Thomson Reuters tax analysis, Canadian motor vehicle exports to the United States fell roughly 22% over the year ending March 2026, dropping from 25. $9 billion to $20. $3 billion, which the administration frames as evidence of Canadian retaliatory measures squeezing American automakers. On alcohol, the drop cited is far steeper. Canadian imports of American alcoholic beverages fell approximately 81%, from $718 million down to just $137 million, largely because most Canadian provinces pulled American liquor and wine off their shelves entirely in an earlier round of retaliation against U.S. tariffs. Those numbers, the administration argues, prove Canada crossed a line that justified an unprecedented tariff response. Here's where the actual cost the U.S. part of this story starts to take shape, because it isn't as simple as the headline 50% rate or even the $20 billion figure. The Taxpayers Protection Alliance, a fiscal watchdog group that tracks tariff policy closely, published an analysis warning that reviving Section 338 risks violating existing trade commitments while, in their words, passing the cost of retaliation to American businesses and consumers. That's a crucial distinction that gets lost in casual coverage of any tariff story. Tariffs aren't paid by the foreign country whose goods are targeted. They're paid at the border by the American importer bringing those goods into the United States. A 50% duty on Canadian dairy inputs is a bill that lands on an American cheese manufacturer's desk, not on a dairy farm outside Toronto. A 50% duty on Canadian auto parts is a bill that lands on a Michigan assembly plant, not on the Ontario supplier. That cost then travels one of a small number of directions. Either the American company absorbs it and takes a smaller margin, or it passes the cost along to American consumers through higher prices, or it cuts costs elsewhere, sometimes through layoffs or hiring freezes. This dynamic isn't speculation specific to this one tariff round. Earlier this year, JP Chase Institute analysis, reported by the Associated Press, found that Trump's broader tariff plans at the time would cost a specific category of U.S. employers, mid-sized companies with between $10 million and $1 billion in annual revenue, a direct cost of $3 billion, a sum the report said companies would likely manage through price hikes, layoffs, hiring freezes, or thinner profit margins. That analysis wasn't about this specific Canada action, but it establishes the mechanism by which tariff costs move through the American economy, and it directly contradicts the administration's public claim that foreign manufacturers, not American companies, absorb the cost of these import taxes. That JP Chase Institute analysis is worth dwelling on for a moment longer, because its methodology is instructive, even though it wasn't produced specifically about this Canada action. The report focused narrowly on mid-sized American employers, companies with between $10 million and $1 billion in annual revenue, a category the Associated Press noted includes roughly a third of all private sector workers in the United States. Those companies, the analysis found, are disproportionately dependent on imports from countries including China, India, and Thailand, which made the retail and wholesale sectors especially exposed to tariff-driven cost increases. Under the tariff rates in place at the time of that analysis, the direct cost to those employers came out to roughly $2,080 per employee on average, or about 1% of average annual payroll, a burden the report said companies would likely manage through some blend of price increases, layoffs, hiring freezes, or reduced profit margins. That framework, cost enters through the business, then gets distributed across prices, jobs, or margins, is exactly the mechanism economists expect to apply here as well. even though the Canada-specific dollar figures haven't yet been separately modeled at that level of detail. On the household level specifically, the Yale Budget Lab, through economist John Eisland, told HuffPost that the Canada-focused tariffs alone would add roughly $30 per household annually in additional costs, a relatively modest figure on its own, but one that Eisland was careful to note applies specifically to the Canadian tariffs in isolation, separate from the broader stack of global tariffs the administration has floated on top of it, which could push total household costs meaningfully higher. Separately, the Tax Foundation's Alex Durante offered a more measured read on the overall scale, telling HuffPost that the products under these particular tariffs represent only about 5% of all U.S. and Canada trade, calling the overall impact, in his words, quite small. But Durante also flagged the more important structural point, the one that ties directly back to the fine print. With this particular tariff list, he said, these are targeting some of the goods that before would have been exempt. In other words, the dollar value might look modest against the backdrop of total trade, but the precedent, the removal of the USMCA shield that businesses had built years of planning around, is the part that changes the risk calculus for anyone trading across that border going forward. There's also a legal dimension to this story that remains genuinely unresolved, and any honest account of this fine print has to say so plainly. Because Section 338 has essentially never been used to impose a tariff before, there's zero enforcement precedent guiding importers on classification disputes, compliance questions, or administrative relief, according to legal analysis from the National Law Review covering the rollout. The statute itself, notably, permits duties up to 50%, allows the president to modify or even escalate the action toward outright import prohibitions, and contains no automatic sunset clause, meaning unless it's repealed or successfully challenged, there's no built-in expiration date written into the law. That combination, untested authority plus no sunset plus escalation power, has drawn direct legal skepticism. John Verno, a former general counsel at the U.S. Trade Representative's Office, told HuffPost that credible legal claims exist, particularly around what's called a non-delegation challenge, questioning whether Congress can hand this much unchecked tariff-setting power to the executive branch without clearer boundaries, though he cautioned that such claims will be, in his assessment, difficult to sustain in court. Forbes' Tax Notes commentary, published in early August, framed the underlying legal architecture even more bluntly, describing this as the United States leaning on Smoot-Hawley era, tariff authority against a trading partner that, in the commentary's assessment, had largely adhered to the terms of USMCA in good faith until the U.S. itself began deviating from the agreement during this term. Now, let's bring this into the present moment because this story isn't finished. It's actively unfolding in Washington and in Ottawa as this is being recorded. As of today, the August 19th deadline sits just days away, and both governments are racing against that clock. According to Bloomberg's reporting from this past week, Canadian trade officials have spent days camped out in Washington, attempting to reach an agreement that would avert the tariffs entirely. Prime Minister Mark Carney has repeated a pledge for more than a year now, telling Canadians directly, quote, Canada will not accept a bad deal, unquote, a promise Bloomberg describes as being tested as never before in these final days. According to Transport Topics' coverage of the negotiations, Trump and his officials have demanded Carney address a lengthy list of trade irritants, or else the United States moves forward on August 19th with the full 50% duties on that roughly $20 billion in Canadian products. Canadian officials, for their part, say any meaningful concessions on their end depend on getting real relief from the separate Section 232 tariffs, still sitting on Canadian steel and aluminum, currently also at 50%. That creates a genuine standoff because it remains far from clear whether the Trump administration is willing to give ground on those Section 232 levies, or whether, in the longer term, the administration will even agree to formally renew the broader USMCA agreement itself when it comes up for review. Canada's own political dynamics are adding pressure from multiple directions inside these final days of talks. According to CBC News reporting, Canada's top trade negotiator has directly warned American counterparts that if the White House allows the new tariffs to take effect on August 19th, it would represent what she called a cliff, a moment that risks halting the broader negotiation process altogether rather than simply representing one more round of tit-for-tat measures. Provincial leaders inside Canada have been vocal too. Ontario Premier Doug Ford has been blunt in his public messaging, telling CBC News that, in his framing, a tariff on Canada is a tax on the American people, and pointedly referencing the upcoming U.S. midterm elections as a moment when American voters could respond to the economic pressure themselves. Quebec Premier. Christine Frechette's office echoed similar concerns, specifically around the continued removal of American alcohol from Canadian shelves, a retaliatory measure some provinces have kept in place even as broader talks continue. Meanwhile, according to Quartz's reporting on the latest round of talks, Canadian negotiators have put a substantial package of proposals on the table. including eliminating Canada's own retaliatory tariffs on American vehicles, lifting the provincial restrictions on American alcohol sales entirely, and reworking the structure of the dairy quota system that sits at the center of the original discrimination complaint. Former Canadian ambassador to the United States David McNaughton told reporters this week that any lasting resolution will likely require Carney and Trump to engage directly with each other, expressing doubt that lower-level officials alone can close a deal of this complexity. If no agreement is reached by the deadline, Quartz reports the tariffs could ultimately hit somewhere between $20 billion and $28 billion worth of Canadian imports, a wider range than the original headline figure, reflecting genuine uncertainty about final scope. It's worth pausing here to note that the administration has pointed to at least one piece of evidence it argues shows the broader tariff strategy working as intended. According to Reuters, cited in coverage from MarketScale, President Trump has highlighted Toyota's announcement of a $6 billion investment to expand truck production capacity in Texas, framing it as proof that manufacturers are shifting production that would otherwise have been assembled in Mexico toward the United States in direct response to tariff pressure. Whether that single investment decision reflects a broader manufacturing shift attributable specifically to these tariffs or reflects other business considerations entirely is a separate question that available reporting doesn't fully resolve, and it should be treated as the administration's stated interpretation rather than an independently verified causal claim. There's also a practical on-the-ground dimension to this that trade lawyers have been trying to explain to their clients in Washington and across the border in Ottawa over the past 3 weeks. Because Section 338 has no enforcement precedent, U.S. Customs and Border Protection officers processing incoming shipments are themselves working through classification questions in close to real time without the benefit of years of prior rulings to lean on the way they would with more established tariff programs. According to the National Law Review's coverage of the rollout, the statute allows duties up to the full 50%, gives the president authority to modify the action later or escalate all the way to outright import prohibitions, and contains no automatic sunset clause. That last detail matters enormously for business planning. Most tariff actions in recent years have come with review periods, renewal dates, or built-in expiration windows that let companies at least estimate how long a cost increase might last. Section 338, as currently structured, could in theory remain in place indefinitely unless a future proclamation lifts it, a court strikes it down, or a negotiated deal replaces it. For a mid-sized manufacturer trying to decide whether to shift a supply chain permanently away from Canada or simply absorb higher costs temporarily, that open-ended quality is itself a cost, even before a single dollar of tariff gets paid, because long-term sourcing decisions are difficult to make against a legal backdrop with no defined end date. Stepping back from the day-to-day negotiation drama, there's a longer arc worth understanding, because this didn't emerge out of nowhere in July. According to the Congressional Research Service's tracking of U.S.-Canada trade relations, throughout 2025, the Trump administration had already eliminated nearly all previous exemptions, including for Canada, from the separate Section 232 steel and aluminum tariffs, which currently sit at 50% on their own. Canada, in response, initially retaliated with 25% tariffs on roughly 30 billion Canadian dollars, or about 21. 8 billion US dollars worth of American imports, though Canada later wound down most of that retaliation starting in September 2025 as talks progressed, while keeping some measures in place on U.S. steel, aluminum, and vehicles. The Tax Foundation's ongoing tariff tracker notes that across this entire period, from the start of Trump's second term through January 2026 alone, the cumulative tariff actions cost American families an average of $1,700 each, as importers passed the burden of higher import costs directly onto consumers through higher retail prices. Layered against that backdrop, the specific Section 338 action against Canada isn't really a story about one isolated $20 billion tariff. It's the latest chapter in a much larger pattern where the actual dollar cost keeps getting absorbed by American households and American businesses, even when the tariffs are formally described as measures aimed at foreign discrimination. So where does that leave the actual answer to the question in the title? How could this specific tariff action cost the United States $20 billion, or potentially more? The honest answer requires separating a few distinct things that often get blurred together in casual coverage. The $20 billion figure itself, as reported by USTR and independently confirmed by CSIS, represents the value of Canadian imports subject to the new duties, not a projected cost to the U.S. economy or to the U.S. government. That's an important distinction. The real cost to the United States runs through a different channel entirely, the one the Taxpayers Protection Alliance flagged directly, where the burden of a 50% duty on that $20 billion in goods lands on American importers first, and from there onto American consumers and American workers, exactly the mechanism the J.P. Morgan Chase Institute's earlier analysis demonstrated at a broader scale. Add to that the compliance costs facing American companies who now have to build entirely new tariff classification and legal review processes around a statute with zero prior enforcement history. Add to that the risk premium now built into any Canadian U.S. supply chain, given that USMCA compliance, previously a reliable shield, no longer guarantees protection. And add to that the possibility, still live as these words are being spoken, that failed negotiations by August 19th could push the affected trade value up toward $28 billion rather than $20 billion, according to the range reported by courts this week. None of those elements individually is catastrophic. Taken together, layered onto an already strained trading relationship, they represent a meaningful and largely underappreciated cost sitting quietly inside what most headlines reduce to a single tariff percentage. It's also worth widening the lens for a moment to consider what this specific dispute says about the broader U.S.-Canada relationship. Because trade between these two countries has historically been one of the most deeply integrated economic relationships anywhere in the world. Canadian and American factories, particularly in the automotive sector, have spent decades building supply chains that cross the border multiple times before a finished vehicle ever reaches a dealership, with parts moving back and forth between Ontario, Michigan, and other manufacturing hubs so many times that a single vehicle's components might cross the U.S.-Canada border several times during assembly. That level of integration is precisely why analysts like those at the Congressional Research Service describe U.S.-Canada trade relations as unusually sensitive to exactly this kind of tariff action. Because unlike trade with more distant partners, a disruption here doesn't just affect finished imported goods, it disrupts production happening simultaneously on both sides of the border. Ontario Premier Doug Ford's comment about a tariff on Canada functioning as a tax on the American people reflects that same underlying structural reality, even if it's also, undeniably, a piece of political messaging aimed at American voters ahead of the midterms. When Canadian input costs rise 50% on components headed into American assembled vehicles, that cost doesn't stay confined to one side of the border. It moves directly into the cost structure of vehicles assembled and sold inside the United States itself. Before wrapping up, it's worth being transparent about exactly where the verified facts end and where genuine uncertainty begins, because that line matters in a story moving this fast. The signing of the three Section 338 proclamations on July 20th, 2026, the August 19th effective date, the removal of the USMCA exemption, the roughly $20 billion trade value, and the sector-specific justifications around dairy quotas, auto exports, and alcohol sales are all confirmed through multiple independent sources, including the U.S. Trade Representative's Office, CSIS, White & Case, Holland & Knight, MLT Aikens, Wiley, Thomson Reuters, and the Congressional Research Service. What remains is genuinely unresolved, as of today, is whether Washington and Ottawa reach a deal before the deadline, what final concessions either side accepts, whether a legal non-delegation challenge to Section 338 itself ultimately succeeds in court, and precisely how much of the eventual tariff cost gets passed on to American consumers versus absorbed by importers in the months following August 19th. Economic estimates like the $30 per household figure from Yale Budget Lab, or the characterization of the overall trade impact as, in Alex Durante's words, quite small, are informed projections from credible economists, not settled outcomes, and should be understood as such. Anything describing what happens after August 19th, including whether Toyota's investment reflects a broader manufacturing trend, remains the administration's stated framing rather than independently confirmed fact. So here's where this leaves us, sitting just days before a deadline that will either be resolved quietly through a last-minute deal in Washington, or will trigger the first real-world test of a tariff authority that has sat dormant since the Great Depression. Either way, the fine print inside those three July proclamations already changed something durable about how trade between these two countries works, regardless of what happens on August 19th itself. The idea that following the rules of a negotiated trade agreement guarantees protection from future tariffs has been quietly set aside, at least for these sectors, at least for now. What do you think happens next? Does Washington and Ottawa find a last-minute deal before the clock runs out? Or does this become the first real test case for a tariff law that hasn't been used in almost 100 years? Let us know your take in the comments. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.